Title. So, the midnight patient. I've worked the night shift in the emergency ward for 5 years by now. I thought I'd seen it all. Like, just told gruesome injuries, life and death decisions, and even the occasional unexplained phenomenon. Hospitals are strange places at night, and the shadows in the corners seem to deepen as the clock approaches like midnight. That night I was sitting in the break room sipping on lukewarm coffee when the pager on my hip just vibrated. A new patient had arrived in room 306. Room 306 was at the far end of the corridor, really isolated from the busier parts of the ward. It wasn't too supposed to be in use, like call maintenance had been scheduled to fix its flickering lights earlier that week, but sometimes in the chaos of the night things slipped through the cracks. I sighed, grabbed my clipboard and headed toward the room. The hallway was so unusually quiet. Normally there was the distant hum of machinery, like the faint buzz of conversation or the rhythmic beeping of monitors, but tonight the air was thick with an unnatural silence. As I approached room 306, I felt like a strange chill crawl up my spine. The door was slightly ajar and the dim light inside flickered intermittently, casting like long shifting shadows on the walls. I pushed the door open and just froze. The patient was already sitting upright in the bed, just staring directly at me. Good evening, like I said, forcing the professional tone. I'm Dr. Mason. What seems to be the problem? The patient didn't respond immediately. She was a woman, perhaps in her early 30s, with long black hair that fell over her sort of pale face. Her hospital gown hung loosely on her thin frame, and her hands just rested in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and strained. "Oh, I shouldn't be here." "Pardon?" "Yeah," I asked, stepping closer. "I shouldn't be here," she repeated, her head tilting slightly, her eyes dark and hollow, locked onto mine. "I was told I was just dead." I tried to keep my expression neutral, though my stomach churned at her words. "You were in a hospital." I said carefully, "You were so safe. Can you tell me your name?" She shook her head slowly. "Names don't matter anymore. Not where I've been." "Where have you been?" Her lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. I woke up in the dark. I wandered for what felt like years, but the darkness never really ended. Then I heard a voice. A man's voice. He said I could come back, but only if I brought him someone in return. The room seemed to grow colder as she spoke. The light overhead flickered more violently, casting her face in stark, sort of shadowy relief. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the unease. Let's see, focus on the present. "Do you feel any pain? Have you experienced any injuries or illnesses just recently?" Her gaze didn't waver. "I don't feel anything anymore, doctor, but he's always coming. He always follows." The monitor by her bedside suddenly beeped wildly, though I hadn't attached her to any kind of equipment. The screen displayed a flat line, the sharp tone of a cardiac arrest alarm, just echoing in the room. I rushed to the machine, checking for errors, but everything was just as it should have been, sort of flawless, except there was no patient connected to the monitor. I turned back to her. "Oh, who's coming?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the corner of the whole room. I turned my head just slowly. At first I saw nothing but shadows, but then in the flickering light, something really moved. It was a figure. Tall, unnaturally thin, and cloaked in darkness. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze, so cold and unrelenting, fixed on me. "Doctor," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "Now, he's in here for you." My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt so rooted to the floor. The figure began to move closer, its form shifting and distorting with every step. The shadows around it seemed to writhe like living things, like stretching toward me. What is this?" I stammered, my voice barely audible. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the woman said, her tone devoid of emotion. "Just now." The figure was almost upon me, and the air in the room seemed to thicken, just pressing down on my chest, estimated. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, my vision blurred, and a piercing high-pitched sound just filled my ears. Just as I thought I would pass out, the whole room was flooded with light. I blinked and found myself in the hallway, gasping for air. A nurse stood in front of me, her face just etched with concern. "Dr. Mason, are you okay?" I looked around frantically. The door to room 306 was closed and the flickering light was gone. I was in there, I said, just pointing to the door. "The patient, the woman." The nurse frowned. "Room 306 has been empty all night. Doctor, are you sure? You sorry, okay?" I saw her, I insisted. "Yeah, and someone else was in there." The nurse hesitated, then lowered her voice. You were not the first to say that the staff avoid room 306 after midnight. They say it's haunted. I didn't be able to reply. I couldn't just The rest of the night passed in a blur, and I avoided the whole far end of the corridor. When my shift ended, I went straight home, so desperate to leave the hospital behind. But as I undressed and prepared for bed, I just froze. On the inside of my left wrist was a single black mark, like quite a thin spidery line, like a scar curling in the shape of a claw. And I swear, just as I turned off the light, I just heard a whisper. You can T-scape. The end. Title: The Passenger en Route, like 17. It was a cold, moonless night, and Route 17 stretched out ahead of me, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through miles of desolate, so far estimated. I was driving back home after a late shift at work, my car's headlights like the only source of light in the oppressive darkness. The radio had just lost its signal hours ago, leaving me in a cocoon of silence broken only by the hum of the engine. As the miles ticked by, the road seemed to stretch longer, twisting and turning in ways that felt so unnatural. I checked the clock on the dashboard. So, what? It was nearly 1. My eyelids were heavy, and I told myself, as you pull over at the next gas station, for a quick hour estimated. If only ID reached 1 before ... It just happened. The first sign of trouble was just a shadow on the side of the road. At first I thought it was a deer, but as I approached, the shape just became clearer. It was like a person, like a man standing on the shoulder of the road, his back to me. He wore a tattered jacket and jeans, his posture hunched as if he were cold. Something about him felt off. Who hitchhiked this far out, maybe in the middle of the night? My instinct was to drive past, but as I approached, he turned to face me, raising his arm in a slow, deliberate wave. His face was pale, almost luminescent in the darkness, and his expression was neutral. Just too neutral. There was no urgency, no sign of desperation, just a blank, eerie calm. Against my better judgment, I just slowed the car. I rolled the window down just enough to speak. Oh, hey, you okay? Need help? The man stepped closer in the dim glow of my headlights. I could see him more clearly. His skin was unnaturally smooth, almost waxy, and his eyes, they didn't reflect the light. They were just black, bottomless pits. Yes, he said, his voice low and flat. Oh, I need a ride. Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to speed away and not look back, but there was something in his gaze, just something that rooted me in place. Sure, I said, finally unlocking the passenger door. So where are you headed? Just down the road, he replied, climbing in. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and the car seemed colder the moment he shut the door. We drove in silence for several minutes. The man sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, his head slightly tilted as he stared just straight ahead. I tried to make conversation to ease the tension. So, what were you doing out there? Kind of late to be walking. So, twist it. He didn't really answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were slow and deliberate. I was just waiting. For what, He turned his head to look at me, and my stomach twisted. His face was too smooth, too perfect, like a mannequin. Sorry for you. He just said. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing a nervous laugh. Well, lucky me. I guess so. He didn't respond, and the silence just grew unbearable. I checked the rearview mirror, hoping to see headlights behind us. Another car, just anything. But the road was empty. The forest on either side seemed to close in. So the trees gnarled and shadowy, their branches stretching like claws. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Yeah, so where exactly are you headed? Just keep driving, he said. His tone left no room for argument. The unease gnawed at me. The temperature inside the car felt like it had dropped even further, so my breath now visible in faint white puffs. I glanced at the clock. The numbers were flickering, distorted, as if the mechanism was just malfunctioning. What's wrong with my car? Oh, I muttered more to myself than to him. He didn't answer, but I noticed his lips just curl into the faintest smile. The road ahead suddenly seemed unfamiliar. I had driven this route dozens of times, but the landmarks were all wrong. The trees were denser, the pavement cracked, and so uneven. Are you sure we're going the right way? Yeah, I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Yes, he said simply. Look, I think I need to turn around. This doesn't just feel... You can turn back, he interrupted, his voice sharper now. Yeah, not anymore. My heart pounded as his words sunk in. Oh, what the hell does that mean? You picked me up, he said, his head tilting slightly. You invited me in now, so we're going where you need to go. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. Get out, I demanded, my voice just trembling. You didn't see him move. Instead, he turned to face me fully, his black eyes gleaming in the dim light. You think you can just stop, just leave me here? His smile widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. My blood turned to ice. Please, I whispered. What do you want? I told you. He said, leaning closer, you brought me here, now we just finish this. The car lurched forward, suddenly the engine roaring, even though I hadn't touched the whole gas pedal. I yanked at the wheel, but it wouldn't budge. The man laughed, a deep guttural sound that just echoed in my ears. You shouldn't have stopped, he just said. The trees blurred past us as the car sped up, the headlights illuminating a path that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The road twisted and turned sharply, and I just held on for dear life. The man's laughter grew louder, more distorted, until it didn't sound human anymore. I screamed, slamming my foot on the brakes, but nothing really happened. And then just as suddenly as it started, the car just stopped. When I opened my eyes, the man was just gone. I was sitting in the middle of a clearing, the forest eerily silent. The car was off, so the keys still in the ignition. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, so my breaths shallow and rapid. I stumbled out of the car, looking around. Frantically, there was no sign of the road, just no sign of the man, just the dark, oppressive trees and the faint sound of the wind. So as I turned back to the car, I froze. Then scratched into the driver's side door where the words, you can escape. I didn't need to find out what it meant. I jumped back into the car, started the engine, and drove until the forest gave way to familiar roads. To this day, I don't know who, like what I picked up that night. I never take Route 17 anymore, and I don't G-drive after dark. But sometimes when I am alone in the car, I catch a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. Just like a shadow, a shape, a pair of black eyes watching me. And I know he's so still, just waiting. The end. Title like The Haunting in the Pipes. The bathroom always gave me the creeps. It wasn't too the usual scared of like the dark kind of fear. It was something deeper. The air in there always felt heavy, damp in a way that went beyond just the moisture of running water. I would rush through brushing my teeth, taking showers as quickly as possible, and just avoiding it at night altogether. But no matter how much I avoided it, the bathroom seemed to call me back with its sort of sinister presence. It all began with the whole noises. Late one night as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, I heard a really soft, gurgling sound. At first I thought it was just the pipes, sort of like, this old building had plenty of quirks, but the sound grew louder, almost as if it were coming from just beneath the surface of the floor. It wasn't rhythmic like plumbing, it was irregular, wet, and disturbingly like human. I forced myself to investigate. The gurgling led me to the bathroom, and specifically like the toilet. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the light switch, just before finally flicking it on. The fluorescent bulb buzzed and flickered, casting its harsh glow just over the room. The toilet lid was down, and the sound seemed to stop, the moment I just stepped closer. Just like the pipes, I muttered, trying to convince myself, but as I turned to leave, the sound returned. Just like this time louder, a wet, sloshing noise, as if something was struggling to rise through the water. Heart pounding, I lifted the lid. The water was still, but just as I leaned closer, something moved. A dark, shadowy shape darted through the bowl just before vanishing down the drain. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't think of a fish or an insect that moved too fast, and it was just too big. I slammed the lid shut and backed away, nearly tripping over the bathroom rug. I decided I was just imagining things. Maybe I'd just been staring too hard and my mind played tricks on me, but as I left the bathroom, I swore I heard a faint whisper. Just like low guttural voice murmuring something unintelligible. The next few days were so uneventful, though the bathroom's ominous aura seemed to intensify. The air grew colder, the tiles damp, even though I hadn't showered that day. Worse still, the toilet seemed to flush itself at random times, always accompanied by that kind of faint whispering sound. One evening, as I sat in the living room, I heard the unmistakable sound of like splashing water coming from the bathroom. My stomach turned. I grabbed my phone and hesitated just before walking toward the door. I pushed it open slowly, expecting to see like an overflowing toilet or a leaking pipe, but what I found was worse. The lid was up and the water inside the bowl was black, sort of bubbling like a pot of boiling tar. A stench wafted from it, like rotting, sickly sweet and acrid all at once. As I stood frozen in terror, the bubbling subsided and the water cleared, revealing something that made my blood run so cold. A face. Pale, sunken eyes stared back at me from beneath the surface of the water, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. Its lips moved, but I heard no sound. I stumbled backwards, slamming the door shut and just locking it. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I tried to rationalize what I had just seen. So, that night, I dreamt of water. I was drowning, being pulled into a dark, endless kind of abyss. Cold hands gripped my ankles, dragging me further down as I screamed. Water just filling my lungs. When I woke, I found my pillow soaked, not just with sweat, but with water. I didn't dare go near the bathroom. The next day, I left for work early and stayed out as late as possible, dreading the thought of returning home. But when I finally did, exhaustion just forced me to just face it. As I brushed my teeth that night, I avoided looking directly at the toilet. It was so silly, I told myself. Nothing could happen as long as I ignored it. But then the whispering just began again. This time, I understood the whole words. Help me. The voice was so faint, desperate, and undeniably coming from the toilet. My stomach churned as I turned to face it. The lid was down, but the whispering continued, growing louder. Help me. I knew I'm just trapped. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. There it was again. Flaw of the face, but this time, I wasn't just watching, it was rising. The water in the bowl surged upward, spilling over the rim as the figure emerged, its pale, gaunt body dripping so wet and horribly misshapen. Its limbs were too long, so its fingers ending in sharp pointy points. It grinned at me with teeth far too many to count. You can tell when it rasped, its voice echoing inside my head. You just brought me here. What do you want? I choked out, tears streaming down my face. It tilted its head, water dripping from its matted hair, to share your home, your whole body, your soul. I screamed and bolted from the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me, but the sound of wet footsteps just followed. That night, I stayed at a friend's place, refusing to return to the apartment. When I finally explained what had happened, my friend Claire looked pale but didn't laugh. There is this story, she said hesitantly, about your building, a girl who lived there years ago, drowned in her bathtub. They say her body wasn't sound for days, and when they did, the water had turned black, just like ink. Some people think she never left. I stared at her, horrified. Oh, that's impossible. Claire shrugged helplessly, maybe. But if it's true, she's still looking for someone, maybe, or something. I returned to my apartment the next day, armed with salt, sage, and every protection charm Claire had given me. I approached the bathroom cautiously, ready to banish whatever was just inside. But when I opened the door, the bathroom was dry and quiet. The toilet sat innocently as if nothing had just happened. I let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over me. Maybe it was over. Maybe it had all been in my head. But as I turned to leave, the toilet just flushed itself. And
from behind me,
the whisper returned, so louder than ever. You can't just leave me. You know what? The end. Title. So, The Stranger at the Crossroad. It was a chilly autumn evening, and the sky was so heavy with clouds that seemed ready to burst with rain. I had just finished visiting a friend who lived on the outskirts of town. My route home led me through the old crossroads, a place that always gave me an odd kind of feeling. The streetlights, they were dim and flickered sporadically, casting so long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. The town had its share of legends about the crossroads. Some said it was cursed, others whispered about ghostly figures that lingered there, just waiting for the lost or unwary. I never paid much attention to such stories, but that night I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't just here alone. As I approached the center of the crossroads, I noticed someone standing near the hall signpost. It was a man tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. The shadows obscured most of his features, but the dim light caught the sharp angle of his jaw and the glint of his dark eyes. He stood unnervingly still, as if he were just waiting for something like call or someone. "Good evening," he said, his voice deep and smooth, like cutting through the silence like a blade. I hesitated but forced a polite smile. Evening." "Out late, yeah." He asked, his head tilting slightly as he regarded me, just heading home. I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. "What about you?" "Oh," he chuckled softly, the sound low and unsettling. "You could say I am waiting." "For what?" Yeah, I couldn't stop myself from asking. There was something compelling about him, something that made it hard to walk away. "For you, perhaps," he said, and though his words might have been playful, there was an edge to his tone that sent a shiver down my whole spine. I laughed nervously. "Yeah, well, here I am. So what now?" He didn't try to answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the crossroads. "This place, has seen so many things. People come here with choices to make, deals to strike. Some never leave." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Deals. He smiled, a slow, chilling curve of his lips. "Oh yes, crossroads are really special places. Thresholds, if you will. They were neither here nor there, caught between worlds. That makes them really useful." I took a step back, suddenly aware of how quiet the night had become. No cars, no crickets, just like the faint rustle of the wind that sounds like something out of a whole story. "Stories have power," he said, his gaze fixed on me, "and sometimes maybe they were truer than you think." I tried to laugh it off again, but it sounded hollow even to my ears. "Well, I think maybe I'll get going. It's late." "Before you go," he said, quickly stepping forward, "a question, if I may." I stopped, uncertain. "Oh, what is it?" "If you were given the chance to undo one thing in your life, just one, why would you take it?" The question caught me off guard. I don't know, I said, shifting uncomfortably, maybe. I mean, who wouldn't want to fix a mistake? So he nodded thoughtfully, his eyes dark and unreadable. "And what would you give for that chance?" So I blinked, the air around us growing colder. "Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean." His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, think about it." Without another word, he turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the shadows at the edge of the crossroads. I stood there for a moment, confused and unnerved, just before hurrying home. When I got back, I couldn't shake the encounter. His voice, his presence, the strange question, just sort of frail or lingered in my mind. To distract myself, I decided to look up the history of the crossroads. I remembered hearing something about it being the site of a few accidents, maybe even just a crime or two. What I found really chilled me to my core. 20 years ago, a man named David Harris had been killed at the crossroads. He was a traveling salesman known for his sharp wit and persuasive sort of charm. Late one night, his car had stalled in the middle of the intersection. While he tried to fix it, a drunk driver had barreled through and struck him, killing him just instantly. Locals claimed his ghost still haunted the area, appearing to those who were lost or burdened by regret. I stared at the old newspaper article, my heart pounding. The accompanying photo showed a man in a long coat and wide-brimmed tats. It was just him, just like, the man I had spoken to. My blood turned to ice as I read the final line of the article. Witnesses at the time reported hearing whispers at the crossroads, as if the wind itself mourned the tragedy. Some even claimed to see David-sized figure standing beneath the flickering lights, waiting for him. I closed my laptop, my hands trembling. It couldn't be true. Ghosts weren't real, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. I really had seen. The next day, I couldn't resist going back to the crossroads. I told myself it was the proof I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But as I stood there under the same flickering lights, the silence pressed down on me. The man was gone, but the air felt so heavy, charged with something unseen. And then faintly, I heard a soft, familiar chuckle, just carried on the wind. I ran and never really looked back. To this day, I avoid the crossroads, but sometimes on quiet nights I dream of him, just saw his dark eyes, his unsettling smile, and his question echoes in my mind like, what would you give? I still don't know the answer, but I fear one day I might. The end.